The bullet struck the wooden post 3 inches from Sarah Calloway's head, and she did not scream because her voice had never been loud enough to matter anyway. She pressed herself against the weathered planks of the general store in Spokane, Washington, her heart hammering so violently she thought her ribs might crack. The summer heat of 1877 hung thick and oppressive over the dusty street where 3 men on horseback were firing their revolvers into the air, their laughter as sharp and cruel as the cracks of gunfire echoing between the buildings. Sarah's fingers clutched her market basket so tightly the woven handle bit into her palm. She tried to call out, to warn the shop owner, Mr. Patterson, who was still inside counting her change, but the words emerged as barely more than breath. "Please," she whispered, the sound lost entirely beneath the chaos. "Someone please." All her life, Sarah had been told her voice was too quiet. Her mother had worried over it when Sarah was a child, thinking perhaps something was wrong with her throat or lungs. The doctor in their hometown of Portland had found nothing amiss, declaring it simply her nature. Her schoolteacher had grown frustrated, constantly asking her to speak up, to project, to make herself heard. Her father, before he died of fever 3 years ago, had been the only one who never seemed to mind. He would lean close and listen to every word she spoke, no matter how softly it came. But he was gone now, and her mother had passed just 6 months later, leaving Sarah entirely alone in the world at 22 years old. She had sold their small house in Portland and traveled east to Spokane, where her mother's sister lived, hoping to start fresh in a town that was growing with the railroad expansion. Aunt Margaret had welcomed her warmly, though she too often said, "Child, you must learn to speak up. The world will not stop to listen." The world certainly was not stopping now. One of the men, his face ruddy with drink, wheeled his horse toward where Sarah stood frozen. His eyes were wild and unfocused, his gun still raised. Time seemed to slow. She could see every detail with painful clarity: the foam at the horse's bit, the dust on the man's boots, the crooked angle of his hat. Her mouth opened, but nothing emerged except the faintest wheeze of terror. Then something massive moved between her and the approaching rider. The man who appeared seemed to materialize from the very air itself, though Sarah's rational mind knew he must have come from the alley beside the store. He stood well over 6 feet tall, his shoulders so broad they blocked out the sun. Long dark hair fell past his collar, tied back with a leather cord, and his forearms where his sleeves were rolled showed muscles that looked carved from stone. His jaw was hard and shadowed with several days of beard, and his eyes were the color of a winter storm. "That is enough," he said, and his voice carried like thunder. The drunk rider pulled his horse up short. His 2 companions stopped their shooting and turned to stare. The entire street seemed to hold its breath. "This is none of your concern, stranger," one of the other men called out. He was older, with a gray beard and a star-shaped scar on his cheek. "You are disturbing the peace and frightening innocent people," the large man said. His stance was easy, relaxed even, but there was something coiled about him, like a mountain cat before it springs. "I suggest you take your entertainment elsewhere." The first rider, the one who had been heading for Sarah, spat into the dirt. "We are just having some fun. Maybe you should mind your own business." "The lady behind me looks terrified. That makes it my business." Sarah's breath caught. She had not realized he had even seen her, yet he had positioned himself as a shield between her and danger without hesitation. She wanted to thank him, to say something, but her voice remained locked in her throat. The 3 men exchanged glances. Whatever they saw in the stranger's face must have given them pause, because after a long moment, the oldest one jerked his chin toward the end of town. "Come on. This place is getting boring anyway." They rode off in a cloud of dust and profanity, and slowly the normal sounds of the street resumed. People emerged from doorways. Someone called out asking if everyone was all right. The large man did not turn around immediately. He waited until the riders were completely out of sight before he moved. When he finally turned to face Sarah, she saw that his eyes were not just gray but flecked with blue, like a winter sky just before snow. He looked down at her. She barely came up to his chest, and his expression softened considerably. "Are you hurt, miss?" His voice had gentled but still carried easily. He spoke as someone accustomed to open spaces and long distances. Sarah shook her head, then realized she should respond verbally. "No," she whispered. "Thank you." His brow furrowed slightly. He tilted his head and she saw him listening intently. Most people would have already interrupted her, asking her to repeat herself louder. Instead, he took a single step closer, his body angling down slightly so that the space between them narrowed. "I did not catch that," he said, and there was no impatience in his tone. "Could you say it again?" Her cheeks flushed with the familiar shame of inadequacy. "I said thank you," she managed, only slightly louder. This time he heard, and a small smile touched the corner of his mouth. "You are welcome. My name is Daniel Oakes. I have a cabin up in the mountains, but I come to town for supplies now and then." He paused, still watching her face with that same focused attention. "I am sorry those men frightened you." "Sarah," she said softly. "Sarah Calloway." Then, because good manners had been drilled into her since childhood, she added, "I arrived in Spokane 3 weeks ago from Portland. I live with my aunt." She saw him lean slightly closer to catch her words, his head inclined in a way that made her feel he was genuinely interested in what she had to say. It was such a novel experience that it momentarily drove away her lingering fear. Mr. Patterson emerged from the general store, looking flustered and carrying her change. "Miss Calloway, I am so sorry. I was in the back room and heard the commotion, but by the time I got my rifle, those cowards had already left." He noticed Daniel. "Oakes, good to see you. Thank you for stepping in." "Those men," Daniel said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Are they local trouble?" Mr. Patterson shook his head. "Drifters, most like. We have been getting more of that sort with the railroad bringing all kinds through. Usually they move on quickly enough." He handed Sarah her coins. "Miss, are you certain you are all right? Should I walk you home? I can escort her," Daniel said, looking at Sarah, "if she would like." Sarah found herself nodding before she fully thought it through. There was something about this man that made her feel safe, which was remarkable considering they had only just met. He was massive and clearly capable of violence if needed, yet he had spoken to her with such care, listening so attentively to her quiet voice. Mr. Patterson seemed relieved to be spared the errand and quickly returned to his store. Daniel gestured politely for Sarah to lead the way, falling into step beside her. His strides were long, and she noticed he adjusted his pace to match hers without comment. They walked in silence for a moment. Sarah was acutely aware of his presence, of how he seemed to take up space not just physically, but in some indefinable way, as if the air itself recognized his solidity. She glanced up at him from the corner of her eye, taking in the weathered leather of his vest, the way his shirt pulled across his chest and shoulders, the large, capable hands that hung relaxed at his sides. "You live in the mountains?" she asked softly. He inclined his head toward her, catching her words despite their quietness. "Yes, about 10 miles north of here. I have been there 5 years now." "What brought you to Spokane?" She felt bold asking, but his easy manner invited conversation. "I wanted distance from civilization," he said simply. "After the war, cities felt too crowded, too loud. The mountains are quiet, peaceful." He glanced down at her. "What brought you here from Portland?" "My parents died," Sarah said, surprised at her own directness. Perhaps it was easier to share difficult truths when you knew someone was truly listening. "I had no reason to stay there anymore. My aunt offered me a home here. I am sorry for your loss." The words were simple but sincere. "It is hard to lose family." "Did you lose someone?" Sarah asked, then immediately worried she had overstepped. "Forgive me, that was too personal." "No, it is all right." Daniel was quiet for a few steps. "My parents are still alive as far as I know. I have not seen them in 8 years. We did not part on good terms." Sarah wanted to ask more but sensed that was enough for now. They turned onto Maple Street where Aunt Margaret's boarding house stood, a tall, narrow building painted cheerful yellow with white trim. Several women sat on the porch, fanning themselves in the heat, and Sarah saw them take immediate notice of her companion. "This is where I live," she said quietly. Daniel stopped at the gate. "I am glad I was there today," he said, looking down at her with those storm-colored eyes. "I would not want to think of what might have happened if those men had not been stopped." Sarah shuddered slightly at the thought. "I tried to call out," she confessed. "I wanted to warn Mr. Patterson to call for help, but my voice would not work. It never does when I need it most." His expression shifted into something she could not quite read. "Your voice works just fine," he said firmly. "The problem is not with you, it is with a world too loud and too rushed to listen properly." The words struck something deep in Sarah's chest. She had spent her entire life being told to change, to be louder, to fix whatever was wrong with her. And here was this mountain of a man, this stranger, telling her the fault lay elsewhere. "That is kind of you to say," she whispered. "It is not kindness. It is truth." He tipped his head in a polite farewell. "I am usually in town once a week for supplies. Perhaps I will see you again, Miss Calloway." "Perhaps," she agreed and watched as he walked away, his long stride carrying him quickly back toward the main street. She stood there longer than she should have, holding her basket and feeling the phantom warmth of having been truly heard. "Sarah." Aunt Margaret's voice called from the porch. "Who was that man?" Sarah climbed the steps, aware of the curious eyes upon her. Her aunt was 55, a widow who ran her boarding house with firm efficiency and rented rooms primarily to respectable single women and traveling salesmen. She had kind eyes and graying hair she wore in a practical bun. "His name is Daniel Oakes," Sarah said, keeping her voice as clear as she could. "He helped me when some men were causing trouble in town." "Oakes," one of the other women said. Her name was Mrs. Fletcher and she had lived in Spokane for 20 years. "I know that name. The mountain man, yes. Keeps to himself mostly. Brings in furs and game to trade. I have heard he is as strong as an ox and twice as stubborn." "He was very courteous," Sarah said softly. Mrs. Fletcher smiled. "I am sure he was, dear, but a man like that is not meant for town life and socializing. You mark my words, he lives up there alone for a reason." Aunt Margaret gave Mrs. Fletcher a quelling look. "What matters is that he helped our Sarah when she needed it. That speaks well of his character." She put an arm around Sarah's shoulders. "Come inside, child. You look shaken." Sarah allowed herself to be led into the cool dimness of the house, but her thoughts remained on the man with the storm-gray eyes who had leaned close to hear every word she whispered. The next week passed slowly. Sarah helped her aunt with the boarding house, learning the routines of cooking and cleaning for guests, managing the books, and handling the occasional temperamental lodger. She was well suited to the quieter tasks, the ones that required attention to detail rather than a booming voice. Her aunt seemed pleased with her work, though she still occasionally urged Sarah to speak up more. On Thursday morning, Aunt Margaret sent Sarah to the general store again with a long list of supplies. Sarah carried her basket and walked the familiar route, trying not to hope too obviously that she might encounter Daniel Oakes. He had said he came to town weekly for supplies, but of course that did not mean he would be there at the exact time she was. The morning was already hot, promising another scorching day. The railroad had brought prosperity to Spokane, but also more people, more noise, more dust. Sarah found herself understanding what Daniel had meant about cities feeling too crowded. She had grown up in Portland, which was larger than Spokane. But even this smaller town could feel overwhelming when everyone seemed to talk over each other, when she could never quite make herself heard in the general commotion. She was examining a bolt of blue fabric in the general store, running her fingers over the smooth cotton when she heard Mr. Patterson greeting someone. "Oakes, good to see you. Got those supplies you ordered last week?" Sarah's pulse quickened. She glanced toward the front of the store and saw Daniel's tall form filling the doorway. He had to duck slightly to enter, and he carried himself with that same easy confidence she remembered. Today he wore a dark blue shirt that made his eyes look more gray than blue, and his hair was freshly tied back. Their eyes met across the store, and Sarah saw recognition and something warmer flash across his face. He made his way over to her while Mr. Patterson bustled off to get his order. "Miss Calloway," he said, and she noticed again how he seemed to modulate his voice, keeping it gentle despite its natural depth. "It is good to see you again." "Hello, Mr. Oakes," she said quietly. He moved closer, standing beside her so he could hear her better without her having to raise her voice. The nearness of him was startling. She could smell wood smoke and pine, scents she associated with the wilderness that began where the town ended. "Have you had any more trouble from those men?" She shook her head. "No, I think they left town." "Good." He glanced at the fabric she had been examining. "That is a nice color. It matches your eyes." Sarah looked down, flustered. She was not accustomed to compliments, particularly from men. "I was thinking of making a new dress," she said softly. "Though I am not very skilled with a needle, I am sure you will do fine." There was something warm in his voice that made her look up at him again. "Are you here alone today?" "Yes, my aunt sent me with a list." She pulled the paper from her pocket to show him. Daniel took it, his large fingers careful with the delicate paper. His hands were scarred and calloused, the hands of someone who worked with them daily. "That is quite a list. Would you like some help carrying everything back?" "I could not impose," Sarah said, though the offer was tempting. Some of the items were heavy and she had been dreading the trip home. "It is not an imposition," Daniel said firmly. "I have to wait for my order anyway, and I would welcome the company." He paused, then added more quietly, "I find I would like to hear more about you, Miss Calloway, if you are willing to talk." Sarah's heart did something complicated in her chest. The truth was, she would very much like to talk to him. There was something about the way he listened that made her feel she could say anything. "All right," she agreed softly. "Thank you." They gathered her supplies together, Daniel carrying the heavy sacks of flour and sugar without any apparent effort. He retrieved his own order as well, supplies that spoke of a solitary life in the wilderness: coffee, salt, ammunition, a new axe head. When everything was settled and paid for, they began the walk back to Aunt Margaret's boarding house. "How are you finding Spokane?" Daniel asked as they walked. He kept his stride measured to match hers, occasionally shifting the heavy sacks to different shoulders with no sign of strain. "It is an adjustment," Sarah admitted. "Everything feels very busy compared to how I lived before. My father was a bookkeeper, and we lived quietly. Now there is always someone needing something, always conversation and activity." She paused, then added honestly, "Sometimes it is exhausting." "I understand that," Daniel said. "I grew up in Chicago. Do you know it?" Sarah shook her head. It is very large, very crowded. My father owned a factory there, made parts for trains. He expected me to follow him into the business. His jaw tightened slightly. I tried for a few years. Then the war came and I enlisted. After I came back, I could not go into that factory again. Could not stand the noise and the smoke and the walls pressing in. So you came west, Sarah said softly. So I came west, he agreed. Bought land where the nearest neighbor is 5 miles away and built a cabin. I hunt, trap, cut timber when I need money. It is a simple life, but it is mine. Do you ever get lonely? The question emerged before Sarah could think better of it. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Sometimes, he admitted, but I prefer solitary silence to crowded loneliness, if that makes sense. It did make sense to Sarah. She had often felt more alone in a room full of people who did not hear her than she did in actual solitude. I think I understand, she said. They had reached the boarding house gate. Daniel set down the supplies carefully. Miss Calloway, he said, then paused as if choosing his words. I wonder if you would be willing to have supper with me sometime. There is a restaurant on 5th Street that is supposed to be decent. Sarah's breath caught. She had never been courted before. Her quiet nature had not exactly attracted suitors in Portland. I would like that, she said, then worried her voice had been too soft. I mean, yes, I would enjoy having supper with you. The smile that crossed Daniel's face transformed it entirely, softening the hard angles and making him look younger. Tomorrow evening, I could call for you at 6. Tomorrow evening, Sarah confirmed, feeling a flutter of nervousness and excitement. She watched him walk away again, and this time when Aunt Margaret called to her, Sarah could not quite hide her smile. The next day seemed to crawl by. Sarah tried to occupy herself with chores and helping prepare meals, but her mind kept drifting to the evening ahead. She had only one nice dress that was suitable for dining out, a soft gray cotton with a white collar that had been her best church dress. She pressed it carefully and arranged her dark hair as best she could, pinning it up in a simple but neat style. Aunt Margaret helped her, smiling in a knowing way. This Daniel Oakes must be quite something if he has got my shy Sarah so flustered. He is very kind, Sarah said quietly. And he listens when I speak. Her aunt's expression softened. That is no small thing, child. Many people hear, but few truly listen. She secured the last pin in Sarah's hair. There, you look lovely. At precisely 6 o'clock, a knock sounded at the door. Sarah felt her stomach flip. She made herself walk calmly down the stairs, aware that several of the boarding house residents had found reasons to be in the front parlor at just this moment. Daniel stood on the porch, hat in hand, and Sarah's breath caught at the sight of him. He had dressed carefully clean trousers, a pressed shirt, a vest that looked new. His hair was neatly tied back, and he had trimmed his beard. The evening light caught the strong lines of his jaw and cheekbones, and Sarah thought she had never seen anyone quite so handsome. Miss Calloway, he said, his eyes warming as he took her in. You look beautiful. Thank you, she whispered, feeling her cheeks heat. You look very nice as well. He offered his arm, and she took it, feeling the solid strength of his muscles through the fabric. They walked together through the early evening streets, and Sarah was conscious of the curious glances they drew. The mountain man and the quiet girl from the boarding house made an unlikely pair. The restaurant Daniel had chosen was small but clean, with red checked tablecloths and candles in glass jars on each table. The owner, a cheerful woman named Mrs. Hodges, showed them to a corner table that offered some privacy from the other diners. Daniel held Sarah's chair for her, then settled into his own seat, which looked almost comically small beneath his large frame. I hope this place is all right, he said. I confess I do not dine out often. It is perfect, Sarah assured him. She meant it, The quiet corner suited her much better than a crowded, noisy establishment would have. They ordered their meals, roast chicken and potatoes for both, and then sat in a moment of slightly awkward silence. Sarah searched for something to say and found her mind unhelpfully blank. "Tell me about your parents," Daniel said gently, breaking the silence. What were they like? It was exactly the right question. Sarah relaxed slightly and told him about her father's quiet patience, how he would spend hours working on his ledgers with meticulous care. She spoke of her mother's love of gardening, how their small yard in Portland had overflowed with flowers every summer. She even found herself sharing how difficult it had been to watch them sicken and die. Her father first, and then her mother fading away as if she could not bear to be without him. "They were very much in love," Sarah said softly. "Even after 30 years of marriage, my father would still bring my mother wildflowers from the field near our house. And she would smile at him in this certain way, like he was the only person in the world who mattered." "That must have been beautiful to witness," Daniel said. His eyes had not left her face the entire time she spoke, and he leaned forward slightly over the table, ensuring he caught every word despite the ambient noise of the restaurant. "It was," Sarah agreed. "But it also made their deaths harder, I think, knowing that kind of love exists but having lost it, both from them being gone and from never having experienced it myself." She stopped, embarrassed. "I am sorry, that was too melancholy." "No," Daniel said firmly. "Do not apologize for your feelings, Sarah. May I call you Sarah?" She nodded, pleased by the request. "May I call you Daniel? I wish you would." He reached across the table and, after a moment's hesitation, gently took her hand in his much larger one. His palm was warm and calloused. "I want you to know that I hear every word you say, and I want to hear more." Sarah felt something shift inside her, like a door opening onto a possibility she had not known existed. "I want to hear more about you too," she said. "Tell me about your cabin in the mountains." Daniel's expression brightened. He spoke of the cabin he had built with his own hands, log by log, how it sat in a clearing beside a stream that ran cold and clear year-round. He described the view from his porch, mountains rising in every direction, forests of pine and fir, the calls of eagles and the howling of wolves at night. He told her about the rhythm of his days, the satisfaction of providing for himself, the peace of sleeping under a roof he had constructed. "It sounds wonderful," Sarah said wistfully. "I have never been outside a city before." "Would you like to see it sometime?" Daniel asked, then quickly added, "I do not mean to be forward. I would bring you back the same day, of course, and I could ask your aunt to accompany us as a chaperone if that would be proper." "I would like that very much," Sarah said. The thought of seeing Daniel's world, the place that had given him such peace, filled her with excitement. "Though I think Aunt Margaret would trust your intentions. You did protect me after all." "I will always protect you," Daniel said, and the intensity in his voice made Sarah's heart skip. "I know we have only just met, but I want you to know that." The food arrived then, steaming and fragrant, and they ate and talked more. Daniel asked about her childhood, her favorite books, what she hoped for her future. Sarah found herself sharing things she had rarely told anyone, how she had always felt like she was on the outside of life looking in. How frustrating it was to have thoughts and feelings that felt large and important but no way to make them heard in a world that demanded volume over substance. "You are heard," Daniel said quietly. "I hear you." "Why?" Sarah asked, surprising herself with her boldness. "Why do you listen when no one else does?" Daniel considered this, his expression thoughtful. "I think because I know what it is like to feel like you do not fit," he said finally. "After the war, I was expected to just go back to life as it had been before. But I had changed. The things I wanted had changed. When I tried to explain it to my family, they talked over me, told me I would feel better in time, that I just needed to readjust. They did not want to hear what I was actually saying, that I could not go back, that I needed something different. So you left, Sarah said softly. So I left, and I found peace but also loneliness. He looked at her intently. Until I met you. Now I find myself thinking that perhaps there could be a middle ground, a way to have both peace and companionship. Sarah's pulse raced. Was he suggesting what she thought he was suggesting? It seemed too soon, too fast, and yet it felt natural, like something inevitable finally falling into place. They finished their meal and walked slowly back through the twilight streets. The air had cooled slightly, and the first stars were appearing overhead. Daniel walked her to the boarding house gate but did not immediately say good night. "Sarah," he said, taking both of her hands in his. "I would very much like to court you properly if you are willing. I know I am not what anyone would consider a good prospect. I live in the wilderness. I have no family nearby, and my life is simple. But I can promise you honesty and respect and someone who will always, always listen to you." "Yes," Sarah said, her whispered word carrying clearly in the quiet evening air. "I would like that very much." Daniel smiled, and then slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, he leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. The contact was brief, but it seemed to Sarah that she could feel it long after he pulled away. "I will call on you again soon," he promised, "and I will start making arrangements for you to visit the cabin if you truly want to." "I truly want to," Sarah confirmed. She watched him disappear into the darkness, then floated into the house, feeling as if her feet barely touched the ground. Aunt Margaret took one look at her face and smiled. "I take it the evening went well?" she asked. "Very well," Sarah whispered, and could not stop smiling. Over the following weeks, Daniel became a regular presence in Sarah's life. He would appear at the boarding house several times a week, always courteous, always respectful, gradually winning over even the most skeptical of Aunt Margaret's guests with his unfailing good manners and obvious devotion to Sarah. They would take walks together through the town and along the paths that led toward the surrounding wilderness. Daniel never seemed to mind adjusting his long stride to match Sarah's shorter one, and he always positioned himself so he could hear her soft voice regardless of the ambient noise around them. Sometimes they would sit by the river that ran through Spokane, and Sarah would read aloud to him from whatever book she was currently enjoying while he listened with complete attention. He brought her small gifts from the mountain's wildflowers, an eagle feather, a stone worn smooth by the stream near his cabin. Each offering was presented with such genuine pleasure at her reaction that Sarah found herself treasuring these simple tokens more than she would have jewels. Sarah learned more about him gradually. He had been 20 when he went to war in 1864, serving 3 years before being mustered out. He did not speak much about what he had seen during those years, but Sarah understood there were shadows there, experiences that had shaped him in fundamental ways. He was 29 now to her 22, and while 7 years was not an insignificant age difference, it did not feel wrong. Daniel treated her as an equal, never condescending, never dismissing her thoughts as naive simply because she was younger. In turn, Sarah shared her own dreams and fears. She told him how she had always wanted to write stories, but had never shown anyone her work, afraid of criticism. He asked to read one, and when she reluctantly showed him a short tale she had written about a girl who befriended a fox, he read it seriously and told her it was genuinely good, that she had a gift for capturing emotion. "You should write more," he said. "The world needs beautiful things, and you create them." His faith in her was startling and precious. Sarah found herself believing for the first time that perhaps her quiet nature was not a flaw to be fixed, but simply who she was, and that who she was might actually be enough. 6 weeks into their courtship, Daniel arrived at the boarding house on a Saturday morning with a wagon hitched to 2 sturdy horses. Aunt Margaret had agreed to the planned trip to Daniel's cabin, with the understanding that they would return before dark, and that Sarah would take a large basket of food to share for lunch, ensuring the entire expedition had the proper veneer of a civilized outing rather than anything inappropriate. Sarah wore a practical dress in a brown cotton that would not show dirt, and she had borrowed Aunt Margaret's good bonnet. She was nervous and excited in equal measure as Daniel helped her up onto the wagon seat. The ride out of town was beautiful. They followed a well-worn path north, gradually climbing into the foothills. Daniel pointed out landmarks: a lightning-struck pine, a bend in the river where he sometimes fished, a meadow where elk came to graze. The air grew cooler and cleaner as they gained elevation, and the noise of civilization faded behind them. Sarah found herself relaxing in a way she rarely did in town. There was something about the vastness of the landscape that made her feel less constrained. "It is so quiet," she said wonderingly. "That is what I love most," Daniel agreed. "You can hear yourself think out here." After 2 hours of travel, they emerged into a clearing and Sarah saw the cabin. It was larger than she had expected, built from logs that had weathered to a soft gray. A stone chimney rose from one side, and a covered porch ran across the front, complete with a chair and a small table. Behind the cabin, forest rose steeply up the mountainside. In front, the ground sloped gently down to a stream that sparkled in the sunlight. "Daniel," Sarah breathed. "It is perfect." He looked pleased. "Come inside. I want you to see it all." The interior was a single large room with a sleeping area partitioned by a curtain, a cooking area with a good iron stove, a table and chairs Daniel had built himself, and a fireplace for heat. Everything was neat and well maintained. Shelves held books, supplies, and various equipment. Furs were stretched on frames, and a gun rack held 2 rifles and a shotgun. "You built all of this yourself?" Sarah asked, running her hand along the smooth surface of the table. "Most of it. I bartered for the stove and the glass for the windows." He watched her explore with obvious anxiety, as if her opinion mattered deeply. "I know it is not fancy." "It is wonderful," Sarah said sincerely. "I can feel how much care you put into it. Everything has its place and purpose." They spent the afternoon in peaceful contentment. Sarah unpacked the lunch Aunt Margaret had sent: fried chicken, fresh bread, cheese, apples, and cookies. They ate on the porch, watching the play of light on the stream. Daniel told her about the different animals that visited: deer, raccoons, even the occasional bear, though they usually stayed clear of the cabin. After lunch, he took her on a walk through the surrounding woods, showing her his favorite spots. There was a place where the stream widened into a pool so clear you could see the stones at the bottom. There was an overlook where you could see for miles. There was a grove of aspens whose leaves whispered in the slightest breeze. "I have been thinking," Daniel said as they stood at the overlook. He had not taken her hand, but he stood close enough that she could feel his warmth. "About the future." Sarah's heart began to beat faster. "What about it?" "I am happy in the mountains," Daniel said slowly, "but I am happier when I am with you. And I find myself wanting to be with you all the time." He turned to face her fully. "I know it has only been a few weeks, and I know I should perhaps wait longer to speak of such things, but I am not a man who plays games or hides what he feels." "I do not want you to hide anything," Sarah whispered. "Sarah Calloway, I am in love with you." The words came out firm and sure. "I love your gentle heart and your sharp mind. I love how you see beauty in small things." I love the way you tilt your head when you are thinking, and how you bite your lip when you are concentrating. I love your voice exactly as it is, and I want to spend the rest of my life leaning close to hear every precious word you whisper." Tears sprang to Sarah's eyes. No one had ever spoken to her with such passion, such certainty. "I love you too," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I did not know I could feel like this." Daniel reached out and cupped her face gently in his large hands. His thumb brushed away a tear that had spilled over. "Will you marry me?" he asked. "I know I cannot offer you an easy life. Winters here are hard and the work is constant. You would be far from your aunt and from town. But I swear to you that I will cherish you every single day. I will build you a bigger cabin if you want, with a room just for your writing. I will take you to town as often as you like. I will do everything in my power to make you happy." "Yes," Sarah said, louder than she usually spoke, wanting to make absolutely certain he heard her. "Yes, I will marry you." The kiss they shared was sweet and searching, a promise of all the kisses to come. Sarah felt safe in Daniel's arms, felt cherished and desired and heard. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. "We should tell your aunt," Daniel said, his forehead resting against hers. "I want to do this properly." They returned to Spokane that evening in the golden light of sunset, and Sarah felt as if she were glowing from the inside out. Aunt Margaret took one look at them and started to smile. "I suppose I should begin planning a wedding," she said. The wedding took place 6 weeks later in the small church in Spokane. It was a modest affair. Aunt Margaret had insisted on making Sarah a proper dress in cream-colored silk, and several of the boarding house residents attended, as did Mr. Patterson and other shopkeepers, who had come to know the unusual couple. Daniel had no family present, which Sarah knew pained him, though he did not speak of it, but several of his trapper friends came down from the mountains to stand with him. Sarah had never felt more beautiful than she did when Daniel turned to see her walking down the short aisle toward him. His expression transformed into something almost reverent, and she saw his eyes grow bright with emotion. When the minister asked them to speak their vows, Sarah found that for once her voice did not fail her. "I take you, Daniel Oakes, to be my husband," she said clearly. "I promise to love you and stand beside you, in the mountains and in the valleys, in the quiet times and the loud. I promise to always listen to you as you have listened to me." Daniel's voice was steady and strong. "I take you, Sarah Calloway, to be my wife. I promise to protect you and provide for you, to honor your quiet strength, and to spend my life ensuring you know how deeply you are loved and heard." When the minister pronounced them married, Daniel's kiss was tender and thorough enough to make Aunt Margaret clear her throat pointedly, which only made Sarah smile against his lips. They spent their wedding night in the boarding house in a room Aunt Margaret had prepared specially, then set out the next morning for the cabin that would now be Sarah's home. The wagon was loaded with Sarah's belongings and wedding gifts: new linens, kitchen supplies, books, and a beautiful writing desk that Aunt Margaret had commissioned as a surprise. The transition to mountain life was both easier and harder than Sarah had expected. The physical work was demanding: hauling water from the stream, maintaining the fire, helping to prepare the game Daniel brought in for preservation. But there was also a freedom to it. She could speak at her natural volume, and Daniel always heard. She could spend hours writing without interruption. She could step outside and see beauty that took her breath away. Daniel was an attentive and passionate husband. He was patient with her inexperience and gentle in his strength, always ensuring she felt loved and safe. Sarah discovered that physical intimacy was easier for her than social interaction had ever been here. In the privacy of their cabin, she did not need words to communicate. Her body could say what her voice sometimes could not. The first winter was challenging. Snow fell heavily in the mountains, sometimes trapping them in the cabin for days at a time. But Sarah found she did not mind. They would sit by the fire, Daniel repairing equipment or working leather while Sarah wrote or read aloud. They talked for hours about everything and nothing. They made love and slept tangled together for warmth, and Sarah thought she had never been happier. Spring came eventually, as it always does. The snow melted, the streams swelled with runoff, and wildflowers appeared in impossible profusion. Daniel began taking Sarah with him on some of his expeditions into the deeper wilderness, teaching her to identify animal tracks, to move quietly through the forest, to understand the rhythms of the wild world. One afternoon in May, they were checking Daniel's trap line when they heard shouting in the distance. Daniel immediately went on alert, putting himself between Sarah and the direction of the sound. They moved cautiously forward and came upon a disturbing scene. 3 men had surrounded a young native woman and a boy who could not have been more than 10. The woman was standing protectively in front of the child, speaking rapidly in a language Sarah did not understand. The men were white, rough-looking, and clearly hostile. "I said your kind is not welcome on this land," one of the men was saying. "You need to clear out before we make you. We are traveling through to reach our people," the woman said in accented English. "We mean no harm. Do not care what you mean. You need to leave." Daniel stepped into the clearing, and his presence was immediate and commanding. "That is enough," he said, his voice hard as iron. "These people are not bothering you." The 3 men turned, and Sarah recognized one of them. He had been among the drunk riders from that day in town months ago. His eyes narrowed. "This is not your concern, Oaks. I am making it my concern. This is open land, and they have as much right to travel it as anyone." Daniel's stance was deceptively relaxed, but Sarah could see the coiled tension in him, ready to explode into action if needed. "You would side with Indians over white men," one of the others sneered. "I side with people who are minding their own business over thugs who are looking for trouble," Daniel said coldly. "Now I suggest you move along before this becomes a problem." The standoff lasted several long seconds. Finally, the men backed down, muttering threats and slurs as they left. Daniel watched until they were out of sight, then turned to the woman and boy. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentling. The woman studied him warily. "Why did you help us?" "Because it was the right thing to do." Daniel glanced at Sarah, who had come to stand beside him. "This is my wife, Sarah. I am Daniel. Our cabin is about a mile from here. You are welcome to come there, rest, get some food before you continue your journey." The woman looked at the boy, then back at Daniel. "You are kind. We accept." Her name was Aida, and the boy was her nephew, called Tokala. They were Spokane tribe, she explained, traveling north to rejoin their people after having been displaced by the growing white settlement. They had been walking for weeks. At the cabin, Sarah prepared food while Daniel ensured their guests felt safe. Aida watched Sarah with curious eyes, and after a while she spoke quietly. "You do not talk much," she observed. Sarah felt the familiar flush of embarrassment, but before she could explain, Daniel answered. "My wife has a voice as soft as morning mist," he said, "and it is perfect exactly as it is. I would not change a single thing about her." The fierce protectiveness in his tone made Sarah's heart swell. Aida smiled slightly, nodded, and said no more about it. They gave their guests food, supplies for their journey, and Daniel drew them a map showing the safest route north. When Aida and Tokala left the next morning, Aida clasped Sarah's hand. "Your man has a good heart," she said, "and you are stronger than you think you are. I see it in your eyes." The word stayed with Sarah long after the 2 travelers had disappeared into the forest. She had never thought of herself as strong, but perhaps strength came in different forms. Perhaps surviving in a world that wanted you to be something you were not was its own kind of courage. Summer arrived in full, and with it came Sarah's realization that she was pregnant. She told Daniel one evening as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge. "I am going to have a baby," she said softly. Daniel went completely still, then turned to her with wonder written across his face. "Truly, truly." He pulled her into his arms, holding her with exquisite care as if she were made of glass. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "Sarah, you have made me the happiest man alive." The pregnancy was healthy, though it made Sarah tired and sometimes sick. Daniel became even more protective, doing twice the work to spare her, bringing her special foods when she had cravings, rubbing her back when it ached. He talked to her growing belly when he thought she was asleep, telling their unborn child about the mountains and the life they would have together. In February of 1878, with Aunt Margaret and a midwife present, Sarah gave birth to a son. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Sarah thought she could not endure it. But Daniel held her hand through it all, never leaving her side, lending her his strength when hers failed. When the baby was finally placed in her arms, tiny and red-faced and perfect, Sarah wept. Daniel kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips, his own eyes wet. "What should we name him?" Sarah whispered, gazing down at their son. "You choose," Daniel said. "You did all the hard work." Sarah thought for a moment. "David," she said. "David Oakes. It means beloved." "David," Daniel repeated, reaching out a large, scarred finger to touch the baby's impossibly small hand. "Hello, son. Welcome to the world." Adjusting to life with an infant in a mountain cabin was challenging. David was a healthy baby but a loud one, which Sarah found almost amusing given her own quiet nature. Daniel proved to be a devoted father, taking his turns walking the floor with a crying baby, changing cloths without complaint, singing off key lullabies in his deep voice. As David grew, the cabin rang with sounds it never had before: babbling, laughter, the clatter of a toddler discovering his world. Sarah found that having a child changed her relationship with her own voice. When David needed her, she found volume she never knew she possessed. A mother's instinct could overcome even the deepest habit of silence. They made trips to town several times a year so David could know his great-aunt, and so Sarah could maintain some connection to the community. But their life centered on the cabin and the wild lands surrounding it. David learned to walk on forest paths, learned his letters from books read by firelight, learned to track and hunt from his father. When David was 3, Sarah gave birth to a daughter they named Dorothy. She was quieter than her brother, contemplative and watchful. Daniel said she had Sarah's eyes and her gentle spirit. 2 years after Dorothy came another son whom they named Douglas. He was the most adventurous of the 3, always trying to climb higher, explore further, test every boundary. The cabin expanded over the years as Daniel added rooms to accommodate their growing family. He built Sarah the writing room he had promised, with a large window overlooking the stream and shelves for her growing collection of manuscripts. She had begun submitting her stories to newspapers and periodicals back east, and several had been published. She used the small amounts of money she earned to buy books and supplies for the children. Life was not without hardship. There were harsh winters, injuries, illnesses that had to be weathered far from medical help. There were moments of loneliness for Sarah, times when she missed having another woman to talk to. But there was also profound joy and contentment. She woke each morning beside a man who loved her completely, who still leaned close to hear every word she spoke, who looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in his world. On a spring evening in 1888, Sarah and Daniel sat on the porch while their children played by the stream below. David was 10 now, Dorothy 7, and Douglas 5. They were splashing in the shallows, their laughter floating up through the clear air. "Are you happy?" Daniel asked, taking Sarah's hand. Sarah turned to look at him. Gray had begun to thread through his dark hair, and weather had etched lines around his eyes and mouth, but to her he was as handsome as the day they met. "Blissfully," she said. "Are you?" "More than I ever imagined possible." He brought her hand to his lips. "Do you remember what I promised you before we married? That I would spend my life ensuring you knew how deeply you are loved and heard." "I remember. I hope I have kept that promise." "Every single day," Sarah said softly. "You are the only person who ever truly listened to me, Daniel. You saw me when I was invisible to everyone else." "You were never invisible," Daniel said firmly. "The world was just too noisy and careless to notice you, but I noticed, and I will keep noticing until my last breath." They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands, watching their children play in the fading light. Sarah thought about the frightened young woman she had been, the one who could barely make herself heard in a world that demanded loudness. She thought about the mountain man who had positioned himself between her and danger, who had leaned close to catch her whispered words, who had seen value in her quiet strength. She had been told all her life that her voice was too quiet, that she needed to be different, louder, more. But Daniel had taught her that she was enough exactly as she was. He had not tried to change her, he had simply changed how he listened. And in doing so, he had changed everything. Years continued to pass in the rhythm of mountain life. The children grew strong and capable, learning to thrive in the wilderness as their father had. David proved to have a gift for tracking and hunting. Dorothy showed her mother's love of stories and spent hours writing in journals Sarah gave her. Douglas developed his father's skill with woodworking and was constantly building things. When David was 16, he announced he wanted to see the cities back east, to understand the world beyond the mountains. It was hard for Sarah to let him go, but she understood. Daniel arranged for him to travel with a family friend who made regular trips to Portland, and David promised to write. His letters arrived every few weeks, full of wonder at the buildings and crowds, but also complaints about the noise and the pace. After 8 months, he came home, declaring that he had seen enough of civilization to last a lifetime. "Give me the mountains any day," he said, embracing his parents. Sarah and Daniel exchanged knowing smiles. Dorothy, at 13, asked for more books than they could possibly provide. Daniel made a trip to town and returned with crates full of volumes purchased from a store that was going out of business. Dorothy devoured them all and began writing her own novel, which she shared shyly with her mother. Sarah read it and was stunned by her daughter's talent. "This is remarkable, Dorothy," she said. "You should send it to publishers." "But I am only 13, Dorothy protested. "Talent knows no age," Sarah said. "If I had been braver at your age, who knows what I might have accomplished." Dorothy eventually did submit her work, and while the novel was rejected, an editor took interest in her and began to mentor her through correspondence. By the time she was 18, Dorothy had published several well-received short stories. Douglas announced at 15 that he wanted to learn proper carpentry and asked if he could apprentice with a master in Spokane for a few years. It was another difficult goodbye, but Sarah and Daniel supported their son's ambitions. He returned at 18, skilled and confident, and built himself a cabin half a mile from theirs where he began his own life. The pattern repeated with Dorothy, who eventually married a teacher she met when she traveled to Portland to discuss her writing career. She settled there, though she returned to the mountains every summer with her husband and, eventually, her own children. David, true to his nature, never strayed far. He built his cabin within sight of his parents, married a woman from the Spokane tribe named Winona, and began raising his own family on the land he loved. Sarah and Daniel entered their later years surrounded by children and grandchildren who flowed in and out of their lives. The original cabin had become the heart of a small family compound, a place where everyone gathered for celebrations and holidays. On a September evening in 1912, Sarah and Daniel celebrated their 35th wedding anniversary. Their children had arranged a surprise party, and the clearing around the cabin was filled with people and laughter. Sarah, now 57 with silver threading through her dark hair, moved among her guests with quiet grace. Daniel, at 64, still stood tall and strong, though his hair had gone completely gray and his movements were slower than they once were. At one point in the evening, David raised his glass. "I want to say something," he announced. The crowd quieted. "My parents taught me that the loudest voice is not always the wisest one. They taught me that true strength comes in many forms. They taught me that love means truly seeing another person all of who they are and cherishing them for it." He looked at Sarah and Daniel. "Thank you for showing us what a marriage should be." Everyone drank to that, and Sarah found herself wiping away tears. Daniel pulled her close, and she rested her head against his broad chest, feeling his heart beat steady and strong. Later, when everyone had gone and they were alone on the porch in the darkness, Daniel said, 35 years. It feels like both a lifetime and a moment." "I know exactly what you mean," Sarah said softly. "Would you do it again?" Daniel asked. "If you could go back to that day in town when those men were causing trouble, knowing everything that would come after the hard work, the isolation, the sacrifices, would you still choose this life?" Sarah did not have to think about it. "In a heartbeat," she said. "You gave me everything I never knew I needed. You taught me that I had value exactly as I am." "You taught me something too," Daniel said. "You taught me that strength is not about how much weight you can lift or how loud you can yell. It is about persevering when the world tells you that you are not enough. You are the strongest person I have ever known, Sarah." They sat together in the quiet night, the stream singing its endless song below them, the stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns. Two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life and a love that had weathered every storm. "Daniel," Sarah said after a while, "yes, my love, thank you for listening." He turned to her, his storm-gray eyes still as clear and focused as they had been 35 years ago when he first leaned close to hear her words. "Always," he said simply. "I will always listen to every precious word you whisper." And he did for the rest of his days. They lived out their years in the mountains they loved, surrounded by the family they had built, sustained by a love that had never needed volume to be heard. When Daniel passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73, Sarah held his hand and whispered her love to him one last time. And when her own time came 5 years later, her children gathered around her bed and listened carefully to her final soft-spoken words of wisdom and love. The cabin still stands in that clearing by the stream, maintained now by the 5th generation of their family. And the story of the mountain man who leaned close to hear the quiet woman's words has been passed down through the decades, a reminder that sometimes the most profound love stories are not the loudest ones, but the ones told in whispers, heard only by those willing to truly listen.